Welcome back to Steps to Statehood Level 1, which is on the American Revolution. In this level, we are learning why American colonists fought for their independence from British and the role the people from Indiana played in the American Revolution. That is the focus of Mission 2. But before we get started, let's review our key point. Many events led to Indiana's statehood. Even after the French and Indian War and the Proclamation of 1763, people still fought for control of North America. Native Americans continued to be pushed off their land in order for Europeans to create settlements and colonies. England began to tax colonists without representation, causing the colonists to declare their independence and fight for it in the American Revolution. Many years would pass before the Northwest Territory was formed and the Enabling Act was passed. These events would ultimately lead to Indiana becoming its own state. Our big question is, what event most contributed or led to Indiana becoming a state? Mission 2 is on the American Revolution in Indiana. Our mission objective is to explain the role of Indiana in the American Revolution. We're not going to focus a whole lot on the rest of the country and what happened in the American Revolution in the rest of the country, but really just on what happened in Indiana. We'll touch on some of the things that happened outside of Indiana, but our focus is going to be on mostly what happened inside Indiana during the American Revolution. Our challenges are to answer these questions. How did Native Americans participate in the American Revolution? Who was Henry Hamilton? How was George Rogers Clark able to claim forts for the colonists? What happened at Fort Sackville? We're going to get started by watching a couple videos on George Rogers Clark. They are in two separate videos because that's the only way that I could get this done, but it'll go over George Rogers Clark and really the main things that happened in that territory that would become Indiana during the American Revolution. Please give them your full attention.
While the revolution raged up and down the Atlantic coast, another struggle was being fought at the heart of the continent, for the future of the continent, the western frontier. For years, American settlers had been pushing their way into Britain's vast lands beyond the Allegheny Mountains. In response, the British began inciting their Indian allies to attack them.
On the whole, the Native Americans, the Indian tribes, supported the British in the American Revolution because they believed that they stood a better chance of retaining their lands than if the notoriously land-hungry colonists controlled the frontier areas.
In 1778, a plan to cut off the raids was proposed by a tough, red-haired explorer from Virginia, Militia Colonel George Rogers Clark. He would attack the undermanned British forts in the Northwest, present-day Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. If he succeeded, he would also extend Virginia's boundaries to cover an area nearly the size of Europe. On the 26th of June, Clark and 175 frontiersmen shot the rapids of the Ohio River into enemy territory. The mission was made more ominous by a total eclipse of the sun. Clark assured the men it was a good omen. Pushing them around the clock, Clark got his men to the mouth of the Tennessee River in 4 days, then led them overland to hack their way through 50 miles of forest.
George Rogers Clark, is he a great tactician? Not terribly. Is he a great planner? Not really. But he can get men to walk through swamps. He can get men to do incredible feats that they don't believe they can do themselves.
On July 4th, only 8 days after they set out, Clark and his men arrived near the British-held town of Kaskaskia in the Illinois country. Within 15 minutes, they surrounded the town's fort and took it without firing a shot. The French settlers were relieved to learn that France and America were now allies and that Clark hadn't come to kill them. 180 miles away, French settlers in the Indiana country happily greeted news of the alliance by turning over the prized fort at Vincennes to Clark's state of Virginia. To hold Vincennes, Clark sent 3 soldiers, all he could spare. Six months later, the fort was retaken by British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, called the hair buyer for his willingness to purchase rebel scalps. When Clark heard of the loss of Vincennes, he lamented, "I would have bound myself for 7 years a slave to have 500 troops." What he did have were 150 troops and few supplies. In the chill of February 1779, Clark began the long, hazardous trek to take back Vincennes. In places, the country was flooded 5 miles across with chest-deep, icy water. Rarely did the men wear dry clothes or sleep on dry ground. Not one deserted. "17 days after setting out, Clark's small band arrived a mile from the fort. To give the illusion of several columns, Clark divided his men and, as in the biblical Battle of Jericho, told them to make as much noise as they could. Colonel Hamilton assumed some drunken locals were firing off their guns until one of his men fell from a rifle shot. The next morning, Clark demanded that Hamilton surrender immediately and unconditionally. Hamilton refused. That afternoon, Clark forced Hamilton's hand. His men had just captured an Indian raiding party, including the young Ottawa chief Makut Mong. Clark ordered the Indians tomahawked in full view of the fort. Clark was still wiping blood from his hands when he met Hamilton. The next morning, the British commander surrendered the fort. When his campaign was over, Clark had claimed for Virginia a territory more than half the size of the 13 colonies. But the land would seesaw between the British and rebels for the rest of the war.
So as you can see, George Rogers Clark and his men played a very important role in the American Revolution in the land that would become Indiana and its surrounding states. Before we get more talking about George Rogers Clark in your notes, we're going to first talk about Native Americans. And this slide is going to cover 2 different slides, and in your notes, it's all bunched together. So I'm going to go away from the slide and then come back to it, and just be aware of that as we go through your notes. After the French and Indian War, the British lost interest in the lands to the west of the 13 colonies. However, the British soon realized that the Native Americans could be very valuable allies. Allies are people that you align with that help you fight in a war. Henry Hamilton was one of these men who really understood the importance of the Native Americans in this territory. He was a British colonial governor, so that means he was from the British government, and he was appointed to rule over land and the people in that land. He commanded Fort Detroit, which was the main British base west of the 13 colonies. As I said, he understood the importance of the Native Americans living in this territory. He met with the Miami and the Potawatomi and urged them, or told them, that they should attack the colonial settlements in that territory. He told them that the colonists would take the Native Americans' lands away if they won the war. And he became one of the most hated men by the colonists of the war. I want to just talk a little bit about his first point when he told them that the colonists would take Native American lands away if they won the war. This is something that Native Americans had been hearing for many years and years and years and years. If you remember, during the French and Indian War, the French told the Native Americans that if they allied with them, they wouldn't take away their land. So this is something that the Europeans, whether they be British or French, keep telling these Native Americans to try to get them to ally with them, even though they probably aren't being entirely true. Even if the British win this war, I bet that they would still tell those Native Americans eventually that they need to get off of their land. But that was something they told them to persuade them to fight on their side. The Miami and Potawatomi, this is where I'm resuming those notes, so you will need to make sure that you found where you need to be and fill in the notes accordingly. The Miami and the Potawatomi, in exchange for food, guns, and knives, began attacking colonial settlements in this land. As I mentioned, they were hoping to stay in their homelands and not be kicked off. The main battles of the American Revolution took place outside of Indiana and in the 13 colonies. However, some important battles did take place in the land that would become Indiana and some surrounding areas, and we've heard about some of those in the video. George Rogers Clark, a man that they mentioned in the video, was one of these men. He opposed Henry Hamilton and fought to prevent the Native Americans from attacking colonial settlements. He organized and led a militia. Remember, a militia is a volunteer army that played an important role in stopping the Native Americans and the British in Indiana and the surrounding areas. He was in charge of this militia. Remember, they said he wasn't really a great tactician, meaning that he really wasn't good at organizing and strategy, but he was really good at motivating men to do their best in these battles. And you will need to read page 105 in your textbook to find out more about George Rogers Clark. The war in Indiana. The main battles, as I mentioned earlier, took place outside of Indiana and in the 13 colonies. However, some important battles took place in Indiana and the surrounding areas. George Rogers Clark planned to capture the old French forts along the Wabash and the Mississippi rivers. They would then use these forts to stop the attacks and then march to Fort Detroit and capture British headquarters. That was the plan. And here you can see a map of his plan. Clark and his militia traveled down the Ohio River, which is in blue here on the map. They first captured a fort at Kaskaskia on the Mississippi River without any fighting. Kaskaskia is right here on the map. Notice it's in blue. They then marched 60 miles north and captured Cahokia. Cahokia is right here on the map. That's 60 miles north of Kaskaskia. And again, they captured that fort without any problems. If you remember from the video, the French were actually glad that he was there because he knew that they would protect him, or that he would protect them from the British. They would then march to Vincennes and capture an abandoned French fort called Fort Sackville, which in the video is called Fort Vincennes because it is in Vincennes. Everywhere Clark went, the villagers swore loyalty to Clark. He was very good at motivating. He was a very likable guy, so everybody liked him. Let's talk about Fort Sackville. Henry Hamilton thought it would be a good idea to go and recapture all these forts that George Rogers Clark was taking. So he and his forces reached Vincennes and Fort Sackville and overwhelmed Clark's soldiers. Clark's soldiers abandoned the fort, and it came under Hamilton's control. Remember, Clark didn't have a whole lot of men to protect that fort, so Hamilton was able to take it back pretty easily. However, Clark didn't like this and decided that a surprise attack would be the only way to recapture Fort Sackville. So to recapture it, he and his militia of 175 men set out again for Fort Sackville. Remember from the video, weather conditions were awful. It was in the middle of winter, so imagine right now, this weather that we're having right now, marching many miles through land, through woods, and even through rivers, icy water, to capture this fort. When they finally reached Fort Sackville, the men were exhausted and they were almost out of food. However, George Rogers Clark really good at motivating. But his soldiers were still able to fire on the fort at night, surprising Hamilton's men, and eventually Hamilton would surrender the fort to Clark and his men. Clark's victory helped make settlements possible for the colonists and stopped the threat of Native American attacks in Indiana and the surrounding areas. This was a very important battle that took place because it gave a lot of peace and freedom to that area. They no longer had to worry about many more attacks. It was a deciding victory, meaning that it really swung the momentum in that land, in that area, to the Patriots, to the colonists who were fighting. Elsewhere, the war was still going on, and it lasted for many, many years. It lasted from 1775 to 1781. General George Washington led the Continental Army, that is the army that was fighting for independence with the colonists and the Patriots, and Lord Cornwallis was leading the British Army. Even though the colonists suffered many defeats, they were able to secure victory after winning the battle at Yorktown, Virginia, with the help of the French Navy. The French became their allies. The victory at Yorktown ended the war and gave the colonists victory and their independence. And we still enjoy that independence today. This is the end of Mission 2. Make sure that you are prepared to answer the challenge questions, and I will see you in our Level Up review video, and then again in Level 2. If you have any questions, please let me know.